Back to the daily grind, and shout out to the full-time patrons. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back bagel biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full time.
MMA.
And it's your boy Taco Bell Wani coming at you with the UFC Fight Night Barboza versus Lee preview and predictions. We're going to cover the main card here. We're also going to cover the Fight Pass prelims and the early prelims on a separate video. But this main card is stacked. Holy flying flipping flapjacks. All the way from the main event to the co-main event to the rest of the main card. We've got two top 15 ranked middleweights, two top 15 ranked bantamweights battling it out. UFC veteran Jim Miller fighting Dan Hooker. Another great fight. Two heavyweights between two up-and-coming heavyweight prospects, Chase Sherman and Big Pretty Justin Willis. Holy smokes, this card's going to be great next weekend at UFC Atlantic City, which is taking place April 21st, next Saturday. So, with that being said, let's start with the first fight of the night between Dan Hooker and UFC veteran Jim Miller. Dan Hooker is 16-7 in his professional career, 5-3 in the UFC. He's going to be facing UFC veteran Jim Miller, who's got 27 professional UFC fights. He's got 39 professional fights. He's 28-11 overall, 17-10 in the UFC. Dan Hooker is 2-1 in his last 3 fights, and he's riding a 2-fight winning streak over Ross Pearson and Mark Casey, while Miller's currently on a 3-fight losing skid to Dustin Poirier, Anthony Pettis, and Francisco Trinaldo, who are 3 of the top 15 ranked lightweights in the world. And Poirier actually just beat Gaethje, and he's arguably in line for a title shot. So Jim Miller has been in there with some really high-level guys. So I'm actually going to be going with Jim Miller to win this fight. He's got a majority decision loss with Dustin Poirier last year, who we just said could be fighting for the title. That was a fight of the night. Dan Hooker used to fight at featherweight, and he had losses to Yair Rodriguez and Jason Knight before finding his success in the lightweight division. So Jim Miller should have a size advantage in this fight, which should help as far as the grappling is concerned. I believe Jim Miller will also have the home crowd advantage in this fight, which should help as far as, if it comes to a scenario we saw at UFC. Who was it that was just bursting out of? We saw the home crowd was helping last week at UFC Glendale, Arizona, with one of the hometown guys. Man, it looked like he was just, the home crowd would go crazy, and he would just, so you know how that goes with the home crowd advantage. So on top of that, he's one of the most experienced guys Dan Hooker's faced, one of the most high-level guys Dan Hooker's faced. So I'm picking Jim Miller to get the W in front of his home crowd at UFC Atlantic City. Now, moving into this top-ranked bantamweight fight between Aljamain Sterling and Brett Johns. This should be a great fight, and both of these fighters have a lot to prove in this fight. Aljamain Sterling, not as much to prove. He's already proven he's one of the best bantamweights in the world, but he's going to prove he can bounce back from his first loss that was, you could even say, decisive. His first 2 losses, Aljamain Sterling is 14-3. His first 2 losses were both split decisions. A lot of people say he won those fights, but hey, you know how it goes. Adelaide Bird works some nights, and so you don't know what the judge is looking for all the time. So Aljamain Sterling lost 2 split decisions, but his most recent loss was a KO, which is what you could say is decisive. But even his opponent admitted, like, I was going to throw a kick. I wasn't even intending for that to knock him out. That wasn't my intention, but it happened. So that was his most decisive fight, but it's not like Marlon Moraes was dominating him or anything like that before that. It was an early KO. He got caught. So Aljamain Sterling has 9 fights in the UFC. He's 6-3. He's coming off that nasty KO loss, but before that, he had an impressive win over a former UFC champion in Rafael Assunção. So with that being said, man, I think Aljamain Sterling is going to prove in this fight. If not Rafael Assunção, was it Renan Barão? Either way, I get those guys confused some of the times. I have it in my notes, I'm sure. Let me check it out. He has 2 split decision losses, Marlon Moraes. So I'm going to be picking Aljamain Sterling, who's going to be, and Aljamain Sterling also could be entering his fighting prime in this fight. But hold on, man, I got to go to a Actually, it doesn't really matter. Either way, Aljamain Sterling, 6-3 in the UFC. Brett Johns, 3-0 in the UFC, but he hasn't fought as high-level guys. Aljamain Sterling's also a very well-rounded guy. He came into MMA with the wrestling background, but he's shown he can strike with the best of them. Aljamain Sterling's one of the best bantamweights in the world. My only hesitation on this fight is the fact that he's coming off of a KO loss. But as far as skills are concerned, I think Aljamain Sterling has proven more. He's one of the best bantamweights in the world. And Brett Johns is coming. He's a really good grappler as far as his UFC appearances are concerned, but his first 2 UFC fights were not against as high-level guys as Aljamain Sterling by any stretch of the means. He out-grappled those guys, and then he got a cow slicer over Joe Soto, who's still not a top 10, top 15 ranked guy, but at the same time, Brett Johns hasn't ever lost. He's 15-0. This will be a real test for Brett Johns. He could win this fight, but I think Aljamain Sterling is going to bounce back, and he's one of the best fighters in the world. If Brett Johns wins, this will be a huge test for him, and it'll show he's one of the best guys in the world. But I think Aljamain Sterling's going to win this fight unless he gets caught or something. So yeah, I got Aljamain Sterling in this fight. Next fight, Thiago Santos versus David Branch. Man, another great middleweight top 15 ranked fight. Thiago Santos is a guy who's been looking for this opportunity. I think Thiago Santos is one of the best middleweights in the world, for sure one of the most underrated. He might not be up there with the champion and whatnot, but he's one of the most underrated, one of the most lethal welterweights in the top 15. Thiago Santos is 8-2 in his last 10 fights. He only lost to Gegard Mousasi and getting caught in a submission to Eric Spicely. Anyone can get caught if it's first round before the fight really gets started. It just happens sometimes, whether it's a KO or a submission. Sometimes you get caught before you really get to the fight plays out. Now, he lost to Gegard Mousasi, but that doesn't count because Gegard's the GOAT, one of the best middleweights in the world, so it counts, but you can't really compare it here because Gegard's Gegard. So, Thiago Santos, 8-2 in his last 10 fights. He's been knocking dudes the fuck out. 5 of his 8 wins in his last 10 fights, probably all KOs, first round, second round. Dude is a savage, and he's going to be fighting David Branch, who's got 2 fights since coming back to the UFC, 1-1. He had a split decision over Krzysztof Jotko, and then he also had a loss to Luke Rockhold. So I'm picking Thiago Santos to get this W. I think he's climbing back to the top 5 of the division, one of the best middleweights in the world. And if David Branch can get this win, that'll be dope for him, much needed, because when he lost to Luke Rockhold, I believe he tapped the strikes if I'm not mistaken, but before that he caught Luke Rockhold with his boxing in the first round, but his grappling wasn't there. So I think this will probably be a back. Someone's probably getting put to sleep in this fight, in my opinion. I mean, I think Thiago Santos, who's got so many I believe he's on a 4-fight winning streak. All 4 are KOs. All right, I've said enough about this fight. It's going to be great. Can't wait. This is one of the reasons I'm really hyped about this card, this fight, and the Sterling Johns fight. I'm picking Thiago Santos. Next, we've got a heavyweight fight between Big Pretty Justin Willis and the Meme King Chase Sherman. Justin Willis is 6-1 as a professional, 2-0 in the UFC. Chase Sherman is 11-4 as a professional, so he's more experienced, and he's more UFC experienced as well, as he's 2-3 in the UFC. But Justin Willis trains with AKA, and he's also been dominating his UFC fights. He's looked great in both of his UFC fights. He won a dominant unanimous decision, and most recently he got a first-round KO. Chase Sherman, as I said, is the Meme King. He seems like a really fun guy. I like his social media and his personality. But he's 2-3 in the UFC and doesn't really have any big wins over high-level guys. Justin Willis trains with AKA, and he's looked great in both of his UFC fights. So I'm going to be picking Justin Willis to remain undefeated in the UFC in this fight. It'll be a big win for him, as well as Chase Sherman has 5 fights in the UFC. And we'll see where Justin Willis goes from there if he's able to pull out the W. So that's my prediction there. Now moving to the co-main event, a great fight. UFC top 2. Both of these guys are ranked in the top 5 of the featherweight division. Frankie Edgar, former champion, the fucking answer, the legend, fighting Cub Swanson, who's re-signed with the UFC. He's coming off a loss to Brian Ortega. Actually, both of these fighters are coming off of finished losses to Brian Ortega. Brian Ortega is going to be fighting for the UFC featherweight title, though, against Max Holloway. So, I mean, he's a beast. But this is going to be a rematch to a fight Frankie Edgar already won, and he won it pretty dominantly about 3.5 years ago. Frankie's coming back from a KO loss pretty quickly, though, which is a concern, but he'll be fighting in front of a home crowd, and I'm assuming he'll be trying to get the fight to the mat as quick as possible and win the fight as dominantly as possible, not let Cub Swanson breathe on the mat and try and smother him. He's not going to quite be able to do what he did to Yair Rodriguez, but I think he's going to try and, win this fight as dominantly as possible with his wrestling and his grappling. Frankie Edgar, I think, submitted Cub Swanson in the first fight in the 5th round. if I'm not mistaken, and he's been fighting the best guys in the world for literally the last 10 years, and he's a former champion. I love both of these dudes. Huge fan of Frankie Edgar and Cub Swanson. They're both legends in my opinion. I mean, Cub Swanson, he's been fighting he grew up in the UFC. Fun fights. I mean, he's as far as legend is concerned, the Hall of Fame, Frankie Edgar definitely has more of a case as he's a former champion fighting the best of the best. But Cub Swanson's for sure a fan favorite, man, and he got a lot of respect on his name coming off like 2 Fight of the Night performances before being submitted to Cub Swanson, before being submitted by Brian Ortega. But I'm picking Frankie Edgar to come in here and get the W. So with that being said, let's move to the main event. Kevin Lee versus Edson Barboza. This is a hell of a fight, but I think Kevin Lee's going to get the W. I got to say, Kevin Lee is a very well-rounded fighter who is only 25 years old, already with 12 UFC fights. He almost became the UFC champion when he fought Tony Ferguson through a staph infection and a bad weight cut. Still had Tony Ferguson mounted and in a bad spot before ultimately being submitted by one of the best lightweights in the world, Tony Ferguson. Habib, Edson Barboza's coming off a pretty brutal loss to Habib, which ended his 3-fight winning streak Edson Barboza was on. He had wins over Anthony Pettis, Gilbert Melendez, and Beneil Dariush. But Beneil Dariush was actually winning the Edson Barboza fight before getting KO'd by a flying knee. So I think Kevin Lee's going to win this fight any way he wants to, really. I think he's probably going to be the better fighter, as Edson Barboza might be exiting his prime, as Kevin Lee is starting to enter his prime. He's going to be the younger fighter, very high level, very experienced for his youth. So I think Kevin Lee's going to have the grappling. He's a very high-level wrestler. If he gets this fight to the ground, I think he'll be able to keep it there. And we saw Edson Barboza, who's known as one of the UFC's best lightweight strikers. Khabib and Beneil Dariush were having some success in the striking, which people didn't really expect against Barboza. So I think Kevin Lee will be able to as well. So unless Edson Barboza is able to KO Kevin Lee with some sort of flying knee like he did Dariush, or just knock out Kevin Lee, I think Kevin Lee's going to be able to come in here and get a pretty dominant win. So with that being said, these are my predictions for UFC Atlantic City. Main event, of course, between Edson Barboza and Kevin Lee. Can't wait. I'm going to do the UFC Fight Pass and also the early Fox Sports prelim predictions over on Patreon, which will be free. If you just go to patreon.com/fulltimemma, they will be free 5 days from now. But if you're actually a patron, you can see them as soon as I post them. Either way, let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. Thanks for checking out this video. This is the UFC Barboza vs. Lee predictions. I'm out. And as always, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit the subscribe button and also hit the notification bell right next to it so you're notified every time I upload a video. I'm out.
This is #1 bullshit.